So without further ado, let me introduce Steve Lambert and Stephen Duncan and their talk, Political Expressionism and Other Fallacies of Political Art.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that wonderful introduction. I always wonder, like, what books are you going to bring up, and the Bob-haired Bandit never comes up. But in any case, I think before we begin, I just want to talk a little bit about how Steve and I got together, because this is a collaborative project. I actually, probably the least interesting thing about me is being an academic. I don't want to mean that when I say distant academics, but that in this context is actually, I was a grassroots organizer for many, many years. And doing that sort of organizing work, I became very interested in how one may mobilize culture and aesthetics and artistic expression as a way to actually reach more people and as a way to also energize people within organizations. And so I come out of this activist background, and then I met Steve, actually.
Yeah, and I had studied sociology and film and a bunch of different disciplines, communications in my art background. And but I also, had like a kind of political side and was putting these together and found out that Steve and I, had this question that would come up very often, which is, how do we know that this works?
Yeah, because this haunts us at night. It's like, we do this sort of creative activism. We teach creative activism to grassroots activists around the country. Steve engages in political art directly. I help him out every once in a while. And yeah, we're haunted by the question of, does it actually work? And so we've been thinking about this
and researching, and we've interviewed probably 25 or 30 different artists at length about how they measure efficacy in their work and different ways that they think about it, and have put together quite a few different ideas that we need to write a book about.
Right, and in a way, this is the first part of that book. We've never done this talk before. We believe that talks really are not about recycling something that we've done before, although sometimes we do that, but is actually using human guinea pigs. And you guys are the guinea pigs for this evening.
So this is the first time we've given this talk, and we're fleshing out a lot of ideas. The idea here, too, is to provoke a lot of discussion, so hopefully we get through this quickly, and there's a lot of time for that. So starting out, the first thing we did, I think, when we were doing this research was to tear down this myth of the artist as someone who's like alone, locked away in a studio, like this lone genius that's isolated in every way. This, of course, is no longer true.
It's no longer true because many artists, particularly ones probably in this room, are actually interested in engaging in the world and engaging with the world. There's social practice programs growing in art schools all over the country. There's now sort of recognized areas in funding grants, museum shows, and what have you for social artists, activist artists, interventionist artists, and so on and so forth.
Political art is basically far more acceptable than it has ever been. And there's a lot of artists that I think are interested in making change, but we're not really taught how to do that in school. Yeah. Like, the idea of thinking about audience is often not really discussed in art school.
Right. It's discussed a little bit in theater programs, particularly when you get to the visual arts. There's something a little dirty about thinking about the audience.
But getting into like the nitty-gritty of like how campaign works, how you affect power, how to actually make change, those kinds of things usually are not part of an arts education.
Right. But we feel that if we're going to be political artists, if we're going to call ourselves interventionist artists, we have to take this seriously. And so really the question is, what works and what doesn't? And how do we start thinking about this? Not how do we end thinking about this, but really how do we start a sort of practice of thinking about political art seriously?
So the first thing is thinking about how we make change. And what does the word change mean? Like, how do we evaluate change?
And this is something, we talk about a lot, and if we do this next week, we'd probably come up with slightly different definitions as well. But we're going to give you the sort of minimal version, which is visible and measurable. Can you see it? And can you tell that it's actually happened?
So, for example, I like to do this. How many people here are smokers? Currently. Just hold your hands up.
There you go.
Now, keep your hands up if you know that smoking will eventually kill you. Okay, everyone still has their hands up. Knowing that, or that if we were to raise more awareness that smoking is going to kill you, that doesn't necessarily change anything. The fact that these people know that smoking is going to kill them doesn't change anything. So we want to think about change as something we can measure, right? We can, like more people not smoking.
Yeah.
rather than more people knowing that smoking is going to kill them.
Exactly. And how we would know if you had quit smoking was not if you changed your mind about smoking, but actually if you didn't smoke, and we could count the number of days or hours or even minutes, perhaps in the case of some of us, that we haven't smoked. I have my cigarettes right here, by the way. Oftentimes, political art starts with the aim of raising awareness. That what we have to do is get people to think about, talk about, start a conversation about something. We think this is a good thing.
But raising awareness doesn't mean you've changed anything, of course. It's a very important step on the way to changing things, but it is not change itself.
Exactly. And sometimes those things get conflated. That is, raising awareness is not creating a visible, demonstrable, necessarily change. It can be, as you said, a step on the way, but it is not a sufficient step. It's what in the sociology world, I'm actually trained as a sociologist, called a necessary but not sufficient condition. You didn't think I was going to use that.
So if we can't see the change and we can't measure the change, then it's kind of about venting, right? It's not leading anywhere concrete. Today's society thrives on venting.
Yeah. So now we're going to take you through some sort of popular fallacies, okay? Or actually popular sort of ways of thinking about political art, which we are going to call into question. The first one, and it's the title of the talk, is what we call political expressionism.
Now, I assume, how many people here in art school, like studying art here?
There we go.
A lot of you. So you know what abstract expressionism is, right? The idea is that, the painter is usually, going through struggles either through the painting or in their life.
Jackson, just paint!
It's about that person's feelings in that moment captured on the canvas. The idea of political expression is very similar. It's about, these are my personal struggles, my feelings, but about politics in this moment. So when Richard Serra made these drawings...
No doubt he was angry. He was outraged, as many of us were, about what was happening in Iraq and Abu Ghraib. And he expressed his outrage. He expressed how angry he was. But the question is, well, what does it actually do? Is any new information being presented here? Is anything being done with this that actually moves one towards action? Or is it what one moves towards a sort of similar outrage?
So, to boil it down, expressing your anger doesn't actually result in any change. Expressing your anger just lets everyone know that you're really angry.
But really, in the end, who cares? Who really cares what one artist thinks, no matter how famous they are, and no matter how good a sculptor they are, okay? Their feelings, their struggles, what have you. Does this actually change anything? Now, we're not saying it does not change anything, but we are questioning whether this probably the most common expression of what we think about as political art of, I'm angry and this is how I'm angry about it and I'm going to show you that I'm angry, which is a very common expression. Actually, we're calling into question to ask the question, what does that actually change?
So the problem with it, there's a few other problems with this. One is it's critical, it's not constructive. So there's no new ideas being presented. It's just, again, political expressionism. It's really about your feelings about the situation. It's not really about change. It's about you, and that there's no space for participation other than this sort of sympathetic anger that Steve mentioned.
Right. In other words, it doesn't open up a space in a lot of ways. It doesn't open up a place. What it actually does in some ways is force you to confront someone else's anger. And you could say, yeah, I'm angry about that too, or I agree with you, or I disagree with you. But really, that's where the conversation stops, because no new information is being created, no set of questions is being asked, and it literally is just an expression.
Yeah. So fallacy number 2 is the idea that knowledge equals power. And so what I want to do is show you guys a really important statistic. All right, now I'm going to show you the facts and the statistic. And now that you know that, what's going to change? A lot of political art functions this way on the assumption that once you know these facts, that this will automatically result in some kind of change, right? Through outrage, through something, I don't know what. But it's this missing information that once everyone knows this, things are going to happen. A great example of this is Hans Hacke.
This is from his real estate show in 1971. We picked Hans Hacke. Well, we don't really like Richard Serra's work. Okay, everybody else's work that we actually hear, we show here, we actually like a lot. And we picked Hans Hacke because I actually love Hans Hacke. I think he's one of the best artists out there. And we wanted to pick hard examples. Okay, it's very easy to slam easy examples. We wanted to pick hard examples and people that we think are quite good. Still,
I want to explain what this
okay.
piece, for those who don't know. This was shown at the Guggenheim Museum, and basically he's drawing connections between trustees or slumlords in New York, right? And it draws connections between trustees of the museum and these slums and tenements in New York that were being neglected. The interesting thing about this piece is actually, we have to concede, it did actually affect some change. The show was canceled. It wasn't ever shown in the Guggenheim, which is a change. And the curator was fired. And as we all know, since Hans Hacke did this show, there are no more slums in New York.
So are we being too hard on Hans Hacke? And we'd respond to that to say he's actually no harder than he is on himself. We actually met with Hans Hacke and asked him our usual questions, which is, how do you know as a political artist that you've been successful? And he gave this great answer.
Which was, this question has been asked me many times, and it requires me to go around it before I really avoid it.
Okay. And it says something that here's one of the great political artists of our time who's been doing this practice for almost a half century, and he himself gets uncomfortable to a certain extent when we're asked about how do you know if it's successful or not. And I think this idea of that power actually, knowledge actually equals power, at one time in history did have some political effect. When there once was a monopoly on knowledge, for example, when knowledge itself was sequestered within either the state or the church, the very idea of having more knowledge or another interpretation, often of the book, the Bible, was really a heretical act because power was vested in a monopoly on knowledge. We don't live in that world anymore. We have an excess of knowledge. We have a political economy of surplus of knowledge. And so this sort of almost knee-jerk idea and ideal of that somehow if we get more knowledge, we will become freer, is really based in an old-fashioned way of understanding how the world works. One could argue that actually in the new information economy that we have too much information. And we have almost a paralysis in the face of the abundance of fact and choice. I know too much, I don't know what to do. I know too many facts, too many wrong things are happening in the world. And to hear about another one doesn't stir me to action. It actually makes me go and drink someplace, okay? And the other problem is that knowledge today is a product, okay? And as we consume knowledge as products, we also bestow upon it the relationship we have to products, which is it's something we own, it's something we possess, and it's something we become sort of spectators, as knowing as a spectator sport, as opposed to knowing as a prerequisite for action and activity.
So the idea here is again, that this lack of information is what's causing the lack of action. I personally believe that people are a lot smarter than that it's more that they're overwhelmed rather than, lacking the motivation to actually do anything. It's true they might not know all the details that you know about some horrific thing, or the history and all the ins and outs of it, but they would understand that something's wrong, or maybe do understand that something's wrong and want it to be better. So admittedly, the core of this idea actually is valid. That you do need, again, it's a step along the way to change. You do need people to be sort of informed to know about an issue.
And lack of knowledge may be an obstacle, but I think it's important to think about where this lack of knowledge lies. That is, does it actually lie in the minutia of how bad the problem is, or does it lie in what steps I can take to change it for the better? Okay? And the distinction really is there, which is this moving away from what is the truth of the matter, and instead to start thinking about what can I do. And if you start thinking of bringing it back to political art, the sort of focus changes for I'm not about revealing the world necessarily and telling a person what's going on in the world. Actually, my role to a certain extent is giving people tools in which to change the world, or information which may be useful, or perspectives which may be useful, frames of reference which may be useful to start to act in the world.
So our next fallacy is the truth shall set you free.
Which, of course, is connected to this as well. By the way, the truth shall set you free not only is from, I believe, the Gospel of Mark. It's also the CIA's slogan. Or it's actually, if you go into Langley, not that I've ever been, but in any case, it's inscribed in the marble floor. Gotta love that. Okay.
So this fallacy builds on the idea of knowledge equals power. The thought here is that the knowing of the truth isn't actually real or visceral enough, so that by making a more extreme or more asceticized version of the truth, that's what's needed to actually motivate people or to create change.
Right, and it sort of recognizes one of the things that art can do is it doesn't just speak to the mind, it can actually speak to the heart as well. It can move one in a sort of non-cerebral, non-cognitive way. But the solution is, what we're going to then do is appeal to the heart, show the brutal reality, and so on and so forth, in order to open up a reality which people have not seen before, or open up the truth that people have not known before.
So here's an example. Go ahead.
So this is, probably the best-known piece of political art in history, at least Western history, and this is Pablo Picasso's mural of the bombing of Guernica by the fascist forces in 1937. And it was commissioned by the Republicans for display at the International Fair of that year. And it's a powerful piece. There's no doubt that it's a powerful piece. It's about the horrors of war, the tragedy of war, and it didn't stop the fascists, nor did it prompt Western powers to get involved in Spain. That's not to say that it may not have led to other things, but as art in itself, did not do that. The logic behind this idea that the truth shall set you free has a really deep hold in our minds. That is, I would say, is sort of at the root of the Enlightenment ideals of liberation. I always like to think about one of my favorite tales, The Emperor's New Clothes, okay? And I don't know if any of you remember this from your youth, but the story goes something like this. There's an emperor who's quite vain, and he's a spendthrift. He likes to spend money and so on and so forth. And these hucksters come to town, parading themselves as tailors, and say, "We will create the most beautiful suit that anybody has ever seen. But it's going to be made of gold and silver, and you have to give us the gold and silver, and we'll weave you the suit." And then a couple of weeks go by, and they haven't done anything. And then a couple of weeks go by, and they haven't done anything. And one day that the king comes in, and they tell him, "But we have our suit ready for you." There's a trick with the suit, though, that if you're not someone who is truly worthy, you won't see the suit, okay? But everybody else will. So the king walks in, he doesn't see the suit, but they insist that it's there, and he doesn't want to show that he's a fool, and so he puts it on. And then, of course, to show it off, he parades around the town, okay? And as he parades around the town, all the townspeople are there, and they all say, "What a wonderful suit he's wearing. What a beautiful outfit he's put on." And then there's the little boy. And the little boy says, "But nothing's on." And that truth goes from one person to another, to another, to another. The town wakes up, throws off the shackles of ignorance, and everybody lives happily ever after because it's a fairy tale, okay? That is at the core, I would argue, of the critical project of the West, okay? This idea that if we can just tell the truth, if we can just get people to understand, then what? We're not quite sure, okay? And then this is the problem with that sort of project in a lot of ways. And it's also a project which is deeply rooted in documentary photography, okay? This idea that if one can actually show the horrific conditions of, in this case, Jacob Riis from How the Other Half Lives, that is, people will be shocked into actually doing something about it. And the wonderful thing about this, of course, is that Jacob Riis rearranged these folks, these kids, to make it much more aesthetically pleasing. But as Walter Benjamin pointed out in his essay in 1934 called The Author as Producer, the problem with pictures of poverty, he was particularly looking at pictures of poverty, but it's extended into other sort of revealing moments as well, is that it often shifted the discussion to one of aesthetics, which is how well poverty was being revealed, and away from the question of what can be done so there no longer are these children, okay? In other words, what he said is that the problem is that a good representation of a bad situation actually turns poverty social struggle, what have you, into an object of contemplation and perversely appreciation rather than any action, okay? That is, you walk into a gallery or what have you, pick up a book and you say, oh, what marvelous composition here. And you forget that actually what this is street kids. Now, that should be said that these photos actually did affect change, okay? Coming out of Jacob Riis's campaigns was the tenement laws of the early 20th century, which meant you had to have certain air and so on and so forth in the building of new tenements. But the pictures themselves didn't create that. Jacob Riis was involved in an on-the-ground active campaign to do this, and this was a component part in that. These, in upon themselves, taken out of that context, become what they become today, which is something one appreciates for its aesthetic value.
So as artists, we kind of sometimes forget we don't have to be journalists, right? There's already journalists. And we can do things that journalists can't do. So the power of art, and I'm going to come back to this again at the end, is that we can uniquely apply our skills in ways that a journalist never could. A subset of this sort of fallacy is this idea of follow me, right? So you read an article or see some kind of documentary or experience something firsthand and you realize, oh my God, this is so important. You know, I found this thing, I read this book, and like now I know about this thing and I want to share it with everyone. So in order to have other people realize the same, kind of come to the same realization that you did, it's like you have to have them follow along the same path. Read this book, then this book, then this book, or watch this movie, and then you'll come and you'll be as outraged as I am and motivated the same way. So if you do all this, everything will be different. You just have to read this book. You have to see this movie, right? This is, following this logic is like sort of like the, what we call the stoner thesis. And it's that, you know, if all of our politicians would just smoke weed, then they would see and like the whole world would be peaceful. Now, as evidence here, this isn't true. But it's the same kind of idea, right? Like, if you did what I did or did it in the same order and it ignores all the culture and background and all the other sort of factors.
If we can just expose people to this thing, the real, the way of understanding the real, ipso facto, something will change. And that's not necessarily true, as Arnold Schwarzenegger points out.
So fallacy number 4 is the whole world is watching. And this one stings.
Yes, okay, this one stings. I actually made Steve put this in because the prime example is his own project, okay? And the logic goes something like this. And a lot of the political artists we would talk to, and we'd say, well, how do you know if it works? They would say, well, you know, I got 32 media hits.
We got in the news.
We got great
all
press.
These reporters writing about it. We're getting contacted by the radio.
Right. And when I was an activist, the first thing we would do is after we demonstration was go and we'd actually turn on the news stations and we'd listen to the radio. We'd look in the newspapers the next day and we'd say, yeah, man, it worked. We got 3 stations covering us. That was amazing. Okay.
This project had the same thing. You know, like Andy and I coordinated all these people to create this paper. The project had way more media than we ever expected, worldwide attention. It was shown in museums around the world. But the media attention and that kind of attention doesn't automatically impact power. It's good, but if your work isn't efficacious in the first place, amplifying the effect of this non-efficacious work is really just amplifying nothing.
That is, what it does is it may focus attention back on the demonstration, it may focus attention back on the work, but it doesn't necessarily focus attention on the politics itself, nor does it necessarily lead towards anything other than reading about this as a story.
So all 3 of these things, has the same problem as that press is a means, not an end, right? And if we kind of lose sight of what the ends are, the end goal is, then it's like, hey, we got a lot of press, this is great. And that's true of the other 3 as well. Fallacy number 5 is that art is change.
Yeah, and this gets a little bit more complicated, but it's also, we think it's a prevalent way of thinking about the politics of political art, which is just by looking at my art, experiencing my art, I'm engaged in some sort of change, okay? If I go to a freaky performance piece, I'm somehow sticking it to the man, okay? And this has its sort of avant-garde version. You know, this is Buñuel and Dali's film, The White Dog. which is pretty freaky, if anybody's ever seen this, okay? And what the surrealists were after is this idea of that if we could really sort of change people's coordinates of reality, then we could also change the world that followed, okay? Whether it was tapping into the unconscious, getting in touch with sort of the automatic self, finding sort of new realities through dreams and what have you. It was, to use an expensive phrase of Jean Rancière's, a redistribution of the sensible, okay? That is, they were after this idea that in exposure to this artwork, the coordinates of reality would shift, and therefore one would act in the world differently, and if enough people acted in the world differently, it would be a different world entirely. That art in itself, regardless of things, would bring about change.
So at least the surrealists were actually serious about creating change. The more contemporary example of this we have is Shepard Fairey. He kind of represents this radical imagery. This is an appropriate image of the Black Panthers. But this radical imagery is kind of stripped of all its politics. And therefore, it's just the power without the politics. It looks radical, but it's really only a radical image. Of course, looking at this work doesn't change anything, and worse, I think it may move us backwards. But the biggest fallacy of all is that art changes anything.
Exactly. W.H. Auden, in his elegy to the Irish poet and radical William Butler Yeats, had this wonderful phrase, which was, "Poetry makes nothing happen." That is, art by itself makes nothing happen, okay? It's art. It's not politics. But he goes on to say in that poem, but poetry survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper, flows on south from ranches of isolation in the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives, a way of happening, a mouth. Now, I'm a social scientist, I'm not a poetry instructor, but I'm not quite sure what that actually means. But I think what he's saying is that he's denying the political efficacy of poetry in one breath while hinting at its effect in the next, which is poetry, like art, resides in untampered valleys and articulates unutterable fears and hopes. It makes nothing happen, but it's actually a way of happening in itself. It demands to be spoken, and from this mouth its imaginings flow out to a wider sea. That is, art is a process of making, a way of happening. It's a mouth, a voice, an expression. And this has real value, especially at this moment. So, change does need art, okay? After we've just spent 30 minutes telling you how this is all hopeless, okay? This is the hopeful section, okay? Which is, we actually believe deeply in both of our practices, but also in the center that we do, that actually art does have something which is absolutely and critically necessary for good political work. The first rule of guerrilla warfare is to know your terrain and use it to your advantage. So it works for political activism as well, okay? It's a little bit of a different game. We're not interested in capturing land and killing people and so on and so forth. What we're really interested in is challenging power in different ways. And we also tend not to do our work in swamps, villages, and Civil War battlefields, okay? Our political topography, the political topography of today, is one of signs and symbols, stories and spectacles. It's a highly mediated terrain. That's where politics gets played out today, not on a battlefield. But this is an aesthetic battlefield for which artists have actually been trained for. And that artists have a lot to teach political organizers and political activists because they actually know this terrain.
So we've been tearing everything down. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what works. And we're going to tell you and lay out what actually works and what you can do to make an effective, artistic activist artwork. We worked on this a long time and we realized we don't know.
Yeah.
How could we know? Whatever it is that you're working on or the issues that you care about, your message, your medium, your campaign, your audience are all going to be very individual to you. And of course, there's no prescription that we could give you that would, you could go out and just do this and it would work. But we do have some strategies that will make for successful work. So tools that you can use in your own practice that can help you make more effective political artwork. The first thing is to know your goal, to be aware of what you're trying to do beyond raising awareness. The thing that we do sometimes when we're talking to artists is like, oh, because they'll just say, I want to raise awareness about this idea. And you're like, okay, so you've raised awareness, then what? And they're like, well, then I would like people to actually, vote on this law and get it off the books. So the real goal then is not actually to raise awareness about this thing, but to vote on the law and get it off the books. So having a clear, defined, and measurable end goal, I think is really important in a lot of ways. For one, the goal can give you a direction. It gives you a spot on the horizon to move towards. Without that spot on the horizon, the idea of the absolute end goal of what you want for this thing, you don't really know where you're going, right? The goal really provides direction and enables us to make better, conscious choices about the project we're doing, right? It's easier to make decisions within the work, because that's the hard part. We're familiar with this kind of conscious choices idea. It's part of our training as artists, right? So as artists, if you're making a piece, you're making choices about, for example, the media and the context and the audience. And once you've made those decisions, you've kind of put a small set of boundaries around that piece. There's this saying I think that painters make, and it's like every brushstroke is like eliminating a bunch of possibilities for other paintings, right? So like as you make these decisions, you're narrowly focusing down and figuring out what this thing is. So these boundaries provide this frame or this way to make decisions. And so it comes back to what is your goal. When you have that goal in mind, then it's a lot easier to make decisions. Now, this doesn't have to be a singular goal. I actually encourage you to hold yourself to a double standard. Most things like double standard is bad. In political art, a double standard is really good. The first part of the double standard is think of the absolute end goal. Like in Buddhism, they talk about the liberation of all sentient beings. That's pretty utopian.
That's a good goal.
Yeah, it's a good goal, though. Really far out there. What would it mean to win everything? So you have that ultimate destination in mind, and then use that as a compass. So you have some kind of internal clarity, but then know the steps in between that lead to that. Because it starts with these first steps. And when you make a few of those steps, pat yourself on the back because you did a good job, right? So hold yourself to one standard, which is the utopian standard, and then hold yourself to the second standard, which is making some progress towards that. Otherwise, the people that only hold themselves to these ideals usually give up political art after a while because they get bitter. Or they keep doing it, which is worse. So there's all these kinds of steps that go along with making change. This is a very simplified communications model that is used for change. Awareness is at first, and then having people actually think about it. So I could be aware of some kind of idea, but I'm not really thinking about it. I'm not even considering it. And then once you're thinking about it, then it's thinking about it again later, recalling it. So many people learn about something, or there's documentaries that I'm sure you've seen that you don't remember at all, right? Beyond that is actually taking the action, which is huge. These are the easy things. And then what's called consolidation, which means that it just becomes a part of how you live. At the end, you're a vegetarian or whatever it is, right? So there's a lot of steps along the way. When you have the ultimate goal in mind at the end, it makes it easier to figure out what you can do along these steps, right? Maybe you don't need to raise awareness. Maybe there's something else in here that you can do. So knowing your goal means understanding the intermediary steps and then where you can fit in and be the most effective. It makes you better. So number 2, know your message. If you don't know what you're trying to communicate, likely your audience won't know either. So having some kind of clarity, clarifying your vision. So your output can be as focused as possible. Nuanced, layered, complex, but focused, as opposed to being very muddled. I'll get back to this.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, it's not about a clarity in output necessarily, and we'll talk about this later. It's really about a clarity in input. The beauty of art is that you don't necessarily have to have the clarity of output, okay? But you do have to have a clear idea of what you're trying to do and what you want to have happen. And then the beauty of art is actually it becomes expressed. That is, you figure out how to do that in a nuanced, layered way.
Yeah.
We'll return to that a bit.
So number 3.
Okay, so, working well with others. the romance of the solitary artist. And certainly, we all would love a little more time and space to think alone. Okay, but it actually works against us when we try to engage in political art. We feel like we do have to do it all ourselves, okay? That we have to make this one piece of work which is going to change everything, which is going to bring the absolute freedom of all sentient beings, okay? And the fact is, you're not in it alone. Politics is not a lonely exercise. It's actually a collective exercise. And what's been the most efficacious political art, I would argue, from Jacob Riis onto something like this, of Grand Fury, is that actually they were artists who worked in consort and within campaigns. Grand Fury, as probably most of you know, was the arts wing of ACT UP. But what's important is they were the arts wing of ACT UP. And ACT UP had an action wing, it had a legal wing, it had a research wing, it had a policy wing, and so on. And all of these groups worked together to create a very effective political movement. The Grand Fury folks never felt that they had to do everything. They had a job to do, and it was a job done in consort with these other groups. In other words, they were part of a campaign, and they were part of a movement. Mm-hmm. And I think this is something that's really dear to Steve and my heart, which is the idea of making activism artistic, okay? That is, when we talk about political art, we often think about making art for the revolution, okay? But that's so limiting and limited. In fact, we think that the most effective way an artist can help bring about change is actually use your training and talent to make the revolution artistic, okay? And this can be on the level of tactics, okay? By the way, that's Steve. At Occupy Boston, making better posters, okay? And making sure that people have fun, okay? And oftentimes this is what artists do, and they do very well, is they'll actually make good props, they'll work on posters, they'll work on PSAs, but these are tactics, okay? That is, there's something which is used in an overall struggle. We actually want to push this a little bit more and get artists to use their artistic training to think about strategy and goals as well. So one of the things that Steve and I do is we run this school called the School for Creative Activism. And
it's like a weekend workshop. We get activists in and train them in how to use creativity in their work, like the creativity that they use in the rest of their everyday lives and how they can apply it to their activism.
Yeah, and we've done them in North Carolina, we've done them in New York. We just got funding for the next year, so we're going to be doing them elsewhere as well. What's really wonderful is working with grassroots activists is that they're really interested in figuring out how we can do things differently. Okay, and so they're very, very receptive to this idea of we can be more artistic and sort of we'll put on demonstrations that are more like performances, okay? Because, we're all schooled in semiological warfare at this point. We grow up watching MTV, we grow up watching advertisements, and so that there's very little jump from what they're doing to sort of giving them permission to think aesthetically, tactically.
But within the organizations that they work in, there are still people above them that are like, we need this to happen. Like, we need to stop this law. And they're held accountable. They have to be very practical in other ways too. And over time, working in that kind of structure can also limit your creativity.
Right.
So what we encourage them to think about is like, what do you really want? Like, what would be the ultimate kind of success for this organization?
Right. Because
and then they'll realize it means dissolving the organization, right? Because they're purposeless.
Because what happens is we do this exercise where we go around the room and we say, what do you want? And these are people that have been in the field for 15 years, and they will raise their hand and say, I want to stop Proposition 3750 from passing.
It's terrible, it's going to destroy the schools, it's really important, we got to stop this law.
And then we say, is that really what you want? And they think for a second.
Or we say, then what?
Yeah, and then they think, they're like, no, actually, you know what, I want schools which actually care for kids of all colors and all races and all income backgrounds and all abilities and so on and so forth. Good. So what do you want? And then it's about, I want a world in which cares for every single person. And it sooner or later gets back to the point which got them into activism in the first place. And then we say at that moment, that's what you want, okay? Because essentially, you are not going to get people involved in your campaign if your goals and your strategies to get to the goals are about stopping, Law 7352, because no one cares about that except you. But if you can mobilize the vision of a better world, that's what attracted you in the first place. then you can actually mobilize people to perhaps stop law number 6352. The key here is actually what organizers do is what the rest of us do. They get focused in on the immediate. They get focused in on what has to happen. And one of the things that we try to do with Steve's artistic training and my hanger-on ability is actually to sort of get them to think creatively and outside the box about what they want, because we believe those are those moments when you get sort of magical thinking about goals. And we also do this in terms of strategy as well, okay? We have an exercise that we do in which we ask our participants to map out goals. To articulate the goal and then map out paths towards that goal.
So the like crazy utopian goal that we got them to think of. And the first one we have them do is like, all right, you want to get to here, how would you go about this normally in the organization that you're in? Using the tools that you use all the time. How would you get from here to there? And then usually that pathway is the one that stalls out on their map.
Because they do it all the time and they get their ass kicked, okay? Which is pretty much what happens when you're an activist. Most of the time you get your ass kicked.
The second path we ask them to draw out is like, all right, you win every battle, everything goes your way, you're like funded crazy amounts of money, like just a sort of utopian dream of like how you would get to that point.
Like my utopian dream as an organizer was always that I could melt people's minds, okay? That I could get a politician up about to make a speech about they're cutting funding to schools, and I would get inside their mouth, and instead they would say, we're giving all the money to the schools, okay? And it was absolutely absurd, but this is the fantasy I had.
So then we have them draw a third path where they like hybridize those two things.
Right. You may not be able to melt people's minds, albeit, okay? But you may be able to figure out a way, for example, to create a prank website that actually looks like the politician's website, but somehow has more rational, reasonable policies that are part of it, okay? Or you might be able to access this politician in creative and interesting ways, okay? Everything from visiting their house and so on and so forth, to, more seriously, going to the church that they go to, the synagogue they go to, and talking to their minister. My father did this. He was part of this Jubilee 2000, and they got to Jesse Helms through his minister. But it takes this sort of absurdity of thinking I can change Jesse Helms' mind about debt forgiveness in the third world to actually get to the sort of practical, but outside of normal pathways of thinking about how can we actually change someone's mind.
So, is it art? We know, like when we've brought this kind of stuff up before, there's a lot of people, there are a lot of ways that people kind of, kind of fit it in their brains or something. One is that they think we're suggesting that artists become propagandists.
Which I'm always ambivalent about that, because I actually think really good propaganda is actually pretty artistic. And the problem with this propaganda in a lot of ways is that it's black and white, okay? That is, here is the message, and we will fill the white void with it, okay? The classic communications model for this is the hypodermic model, okay? This model came out after World War II when people were trying to figure out how propaganda worked. And essentially it was this notion that one injected the message into the helpless individual, okay? And, the problem is a lot of political art actually falls into this category. This idea that if people would just stop Bush and thinking about stopping Bush, something would happen, okay? The problem with this is twofold. One is it's authoritarian, okay? The idea that you have a message which other people are going to take into their brain is essentially the fundamentals of authoritarian propaganda, which if you're an authoritarian is actually not a problem at all, okay? But if you believe in democracy and liberty and, autonomy, it's actually deeply problematic. And the other problem is it doesn't work, okay? That is, we're not idiots. That is this stuff, you just look at it and you either agree before you see it or you don't agree with it even after you've seen it, okay? Essentially, we're rightfully suspicious of people telling us what to do.
So I believe art is often less about controlling the outcome of the viewer, like we were talking about before, and it's more about stimulating some kind of process that can lead to many outcomes. And this is the model that I've kind of come up with, or modified, I should say. This is a kind of standard communications model that maybe you guys have seen. Again, I've simplified it. But the idea is that you have a speaker on one side, and they come up with an idea, right? And that idea is formulated in their head and then needs to be encoded into some kind of message. Sometimes that's speech. And then on the other side, the person decodes that message by hearing it, right? And their brain processes that, and then they receive the idea, right? And in standard communications, if the idea on this side and the idea on that side are different at all, then like that's a communication problem, right? What you want to do is get that idea into the other person's head as best you can. We want to suggest another way to think about the impact of political art, and another model for communications. For us, it's different, right? So we've got the artist on one side and the audience on the other. And in this one, again, it's like the clarity of input, the clarity of like having a goal in mind, knowing what you want, knowing what your message is, provides a real spectrum of meaning and action on the output, and I'll explain. So the artist comes up with some kind of concept or idea that they encode into an artwork instead of speech, right? And then on the other side, it's actually fragments and turns into multiple different kind of ideas, right? So you can have like a straight read of it, and then you could have this sort of, there's like this layer of irony, and then a layer of sincerity, and a layer of, passion or something like that, right? So like artworks, of course, can have many ways of reading them, and all of them are right, and they all, if done well, can be intended by this person on the other side, or like happy accidents, things that we call it. So really the artwork acts more like a prism. And again, it's about this, like if you think about how a prism works, if you shine a real, a beam of light into a prism, you'll get the spectrum on the other side. If you just flood the prism with light, and put it under a floodlight and set it on a table, it's not going to do anything. So you have to have this clarity of input and intent to get that output.
Right. And the output of the nuance is important, okay? Because if it doesn't have an output in the nuance, it clearly is propaganda, which, as we said, is problematic for political reasons. It's also problematic for efficacious reasons. One of the beauties of art is actually you don't control the process completely, okay? And part of being an artist as an activist is giving up a little bit on the control of the output. We actually think this is a good political thing, which is to not try to control what someone gets from it. But that doesn't excuse an artist from not being crystal clear about what their message and their goals are in the input, okay? That is, you have to be clear, you have to have real purpose on the input, and then actually give up and see what happens in the output.
So art is a beautiful and like slippery thing, not like propaganda. It can morph and hybridize any practice or profession and attitude, and possessing all of their strengths but none of their weaknesses. And artists as a career or a profession or a practice are really unique in having this kind of latitude. Again, like we can do things that politicians can't, that journalists can't, that everyday people aren't even allowed to do. And we have this ability, right? And that power is really to be leveraged as an artist.
Now, visible and measurable change is really a tough standard to hold oneself to. And often when we talk to artists, they're reluctant and they're resistant because they feel like it's shackling their creativity. But we actually think that what it really does is it means holding yourself accountable, okay? That is, it's not about applying someone else's idea of change, someone else's idea of what you should be doing. It's about having conscious choice about what you are doing and then holding yourself accountable. It's scary, but we actually think it makes for stronger work, stronger politically, and also stronger aesthetically.
So another thing to remember is like making one piece. I used to get really frustrated trying to think of this kind of magic bullet artwork that was going to transform people, and take them across all those steps that I showed you earlier. But your career, and the bad news is that's not going to happen. But your career of work in concert with other people's work, artistic, cultural, and political, like teamed up over time, may do that. Change doesn't really happen overnight. You might contribute to a winning political campaign in the short run, or changing the way we define politics in the very long run, going back to what Duncombe called the redistribution of the sensible, right? but be patient, keep working at it.
And I think the main thing is this isn't a prescription, okay? You can't just apply a blanket set of principles and hope to have good art.
You also can't tell artists how to make art and have them listen.
Exactly, even if they wanted to.
But if, as an artist, you want to affect change, we think, based on the research we've done in the lab, we think this will make
when
you
we were
more...
white coats.
Yeah, we test everything. But I mean, based on our experience and our research, we think that that using these kinds of tools will make you more effective. Another thing that I try to keep in mind is that I only have so much energy and time to commit to this stuff. So I basically want to be as effective as I possibly can. You should have a life, like you need to have time to have a life, and you're going to die. So working with the goal means using that finite resource of yourself and your energy as efficiently as possible.
Exactly. I mean, if we're going to call ourselves political or engaged or interventionist or social practice artists, then I think we really do have a responsibility to think about, does this really actually engage anybody? Is it actually really intervening? Is it really actually political? Are we really engaged in a social practice? And if we're going to call ourselves that, it really are beholden upon ourselves to think seriously about what it takes to make a real change in this world.
Like, when we say affecting politics, I think not like the political system, but actually politics is in affecting power. And these are tough questions. It's scary questions. But we need to ask ourselves seriously, do we want to win? And we do. So that's it. Thank you very much. We were hoping it would be 50 minutes long, and it was 49 minutes, 30 seconds. I feel like you guys got to know that. Yeah.
Can you guys hold in one of those workshops here in Pittsburgh?
Sure, we can.
We don't know where they're going to be yet.
Yeah.
We just got notified that they're funded last week.
Right, we basically work with Soros foundations, Open Society foundations, and they have grassroots organizations. Their strongholds are in Texas and North Carolina and a couple of other states, but we can suggest doing something in Western Pennsylvania, which would be actually really good. And if they have member groups here. Yes.
So, the fallacies that art can affect change. No, it's really interesting. For me, I think a lot of one way one could think about kind of replying to that is to question what you mean by reading an artwork, particularly if the artwork is not read but executed. So I'm part of a collective called the Free Art and Technology Laboratory, or FAT Lab, and one way that we conduct our artistic practice is by releasing software, open source software to the public in the form of tools that people can execute themselves, where instead of just sort of saying, hey, look at this, don't you feel changed? Change actually can come in the form of something that they actually execute rather than read. And I was curious if you could comment on a strategy like that.
I think that's great. I mean, the first question I want to ask back to you is, what sort of programs are they? I mean, are they useful tools or poetic tools, or?
I would call them.
Not that I would separate the two.
Yeah, and so, well, the group does a diverse, type of work. Some of it is tools for play, some of it's useful tools, some of it's poetic tools, some of it's tactical media tools, some of it's tools for producing graffiti in public spaces using, really rapid, lightweight technology. Some of it's tools for helping the disabled. Some of it's tools for allowing new forms of play and critique and things like that.
Did you trace actually where it goes and what happens and have a feedback loop so you can find out what people are doing?
Through downloads and blogs and pingbacks and things like that. I mean,
But also other people modifying the software.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Like,
so this is measurable through GitHub,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's interesting. That essay I quoted, the author's producer, Benjamin has this whole thing where he basically says, what makes good political art? And he disses this sort of aestheticization of social problems art. And he says that what makes good art is art that makes other artists. It basically breaks down the walls between production and consumption, and what he was thinking about the sort of social relations of capitalism. And in some ways, what you're talking about is, well, you can gauge, if you want to take that on, it's like, well, we know it works if people not only are using it, but are also modifying it, and therefore becoming us as we travel forward. And I guess that the question, how we respond to that is like, well, what do you want to do? You know what I mean? And in some ways, because what we are really resistant to doing is coming in and both in our workshops, but also just, as individuals, of telling people what their goals should be. And we're much more interested in people thinking about sitting down and saying, well, what do we want to have happen? And that decision might be, we will have a success if essentially, in the short term, people use our products. In the longer term, people start to create new products out of them, and then the freedom of all sentient beings. Or actually, in this case,
that's kind
maybe
of
non-sentient beings as well, because it's a tech project.
That's kind of the plan.
Yeah. I mean, and I think having someone use and modify that software is one of those important steps along the way, beyond them just looking at it. Them looking at it sort of like the awareness level, but engaging it and changing it means taking action, like making a decision and taking action. And yeah, again, it goes back to what your goals are, but I think based on what I know that, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, let me go back to the first half. I remember a time, or maybe I'm just old enough to remember a time when both of those alternatives, sort of the instrumental direct message art and modernist surrealism or Godard. I was thinking Godard.
Yeah, Godard
surrealism.
is perfect. Right?
I was like, I remember a time when I felt passionate about one, and my friends felt passionate about the other, and we were convinced that whoever had one was convinced that it was the wrong kind of political art. And something has happened in the last 40 years to make your argument just irrefutable. That those two options don't seem.
Thank you for saying
Those two options don't seem.
Did you get that on tape?
They don't seem obviously right anymore. And so you're speaking to an alternative in the second part. But I'm unclear what you see as the change in the world. What changed in the world that makes both of those 20th century options sort of not seem enough?
Well, I'll back up and move forward, okay? And just to say, two ways to look at these sort of two schools is one is the mimetic, representational, that is, what we're going to do is give a direct read on society, and the other is the sort of avant-garde, which is what we're going to do is we're going to give a different language to imagine something else. And the question is, why is it that in a single presentation, also we say, you know what, let's move beyond that? I think that maybe it has to do with something quite simply that they were trying and it didn't work. That is, we have had such good representations of social struggle and poverty in the past 100 years, okay? Since the rise of, say, the war photography of the Crimean War, or from Goya on. I mean, if that didn't work, nothing's going to work, okay? And not only that, but we've seen the saturation to the point where it becomes a product to be bought and consumed. On the other hand, the avant-garde, which is at that moment, if you think about sort of the role of the Russian avant-garde and the idealism which was captured in there, that we fundamentally can change and create the new man. Well, two things happened. One is the new man got really scary. Okay? And to a certain extent, the avant-garde practice of refuting the now and the hope for the idealized future really led to some horrible totalitarian experiments in the 20th century. So I think there's been a reaction and a pullback from that. I also think in some ways it too became gobbled up, institutionalized, and so on and so forth, and put into university settings, galleries, and so on and so forth. And so that promise that this thing could somehow break out of the rational machine, say that the surrealists were so desperate to break out of. Actually, no, the rational machine figured out how to make a space for it. Not only that, but perhaps profited by it.
I wonder if I could just, thank you. I wonder if I could just follow up with one quick question on the second part of the
Oh yeah, that's the hard part. That's why we avoided that.
When you put up that alternative to the direct idea-to-idea communication, what I was struck by was not the prism to the audience, which I certainly see your point there. I was struck by how solitary you still see the artist. There was one artist there. It wasn't a social process of art making. And I'm wondering if that isn't indispensable to how we're looking at this here. Several producers at once.
You're absolutely right. I put it together yesterday and I didn't think about that.
So the next time you see this, you'll find three people.
Yeah. And yeah, it undermines the other point we were making, which is like, you know, working in concert with people with a lot of different skills so that you don't have to play the role of a policymaker, a lobbyist, you know, a media team and all these things actually frees you up. It's very freeing rather than limiting.
But I think that there's something underneath your question which intrigues me and intimidates me, which is, I think you're putting a finger on that we haven't worked out what works yet. And I think we're very much in the process of trying to figure that out. I think if we're pushed, we'd say it's art embedded within a process as opposed to the art object itself. And I think you sort of picked up on that in the sort of collective process. But I think that's kind of, like I said, this is a thought experiment kind of working out of some of these principles. And it's much easier to criticize what doesn't work than try to kind of figure out what may work. But we're in that process.
Well, just real quickly, I don't want to take up time for questions, but the thing is, like, nothing has ever worked. Like, no artwork has ever worked, and no social or whatever policy has ever worked. They all fail, right? So the idea of making something that works might, like, permanently, you know, may never happen. But making things that work, like, sort of temporarily and can move us incrementally can help a lot. I don't know why. How about that guy with the hat? Yeah.
I was just struck by how much throughout your presentation you used the word change. In your perspective, or in your thoughts, do you feel that political art can be not about change, about maintenance, about maintaining things that currently exist, or celebrating things that exist now, but are at fear for being lost?
Yeah. In San Francisco, I worked with the San Francisco Print Collective, who would make like anti-war posters and posters about gentrification in the Mission District of San Francisco, where that stuff was happening. And most people knew about it, were like very engaged in it. And that was like a big criticism. Was like, and even for me, I was like, why aren't we going to the suburbs and hanging these up? And it was like, well, we need to. There's like value in preaching to the choir. Those people that culture needs to be maintained. But the reason I think we focus on change, or the idea of change, is because it's very general, and that we want you to be able to kind of apply your goals or whatever to whatever we're talking about.
Although I got a slightly different read on your question, which is, I'd say 80% of, or 90% or 95% of art is about maintenance. It maintains the system that we have right now. And so it is political, even if one doesn't necessarily see themselves as political. Yes?
Is there a reason why hardly any of the examples that you showed are by women?
Well, I think we only showed 4 or 5 examples and we made fun of them. So I think that we could have actually, but when we do our actual stuff about political art that we think actually works, it's much more gender balanced and it's much more nuanced in terms of race as well. But I think we only have 3 or 4 up there. And these are the pieces which one actually, you know, in some ways become the standard bearers, partly because they're male artists, for what political art is. And we wanted to sort of deconstruct those ones.
But there's plenty of political art.
Yeah, no, we use it in other lectures. But, yeah.
I think there's a section that's kind of missing for me in the presentation, which is about collaboration, or what I'm interested in is meaningful collaboration. And it's the type of artists who would see themselves as a catalyst or a facilitator. We just recently had talks by Christopher Ditchko and Carol Conde and Carl Beveridge, who very much will put themselves in a situation and work with people and try and collaborate with people in a meaningful way to give them a voice or give them some form of empowerment. That can work and it can't work. You know, sometimes that can be a patronizing relationship between the artist and a group of people, and sometimes I feel it can work very well as a means of change.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, I think in some ways our practice as artists is moving towards that in the sort of training work that we do. I mean, we don't go into, talk to community organizers and say, hey, look, we're artists from New York City, you know, in Boston. We're going to tell you what to think and how to think it and how to express it. We actually, the main thing we try to do is tap into the sort of creative capabilities that people already have, and actually try to get, in some ways, sort of say, okay, how do we work with these? How can we facilitate your creative abilities to actually work on your campaigns? And one of the wonderful things about, say, working in North Carolina was that we knew nothing about the situation. And I thought it was a much more successful one than the one we did in New York. We've actually asked to be moved, not in New York, in Chicago, and so on and so places, because we tend, in those situations, to essentially be preaching to the converted and doing less facilitation and more, in some ways, collaboration, which is interesting. But the facilitation role, I think, is really interesting when it works well, because it is about providing sort of a way of seeing and a way of thinking that allows other people's voices to come through. When it works well, it can also be really patronizing too.
Sorry, go ahead.
You right there? No, red vest. I mean, red shirt. You can go first.
I'm just wondering, and this might be since we're at a university, et cetera, but what is the role of the critic in this, as you see it? So, if you sort of in the model, right, you've got the prism there, and I wonder if the role of the critic is more to be a part of that prism and sort of maybe help the split to even happen more, or whether there's the danger always of the critic, or I mean, and I'm talking sort of more scholarly critic, like sympathetic critic, rather than media as critic, right? But or if the critic often can just make it so all you see is the red wavelength, for instance, right? Often red, I guess. But so, yeah, where do you see the role of the critic in the whole?
What you described makes sense to me, and if they were a bad critic, they might only highlight or isolate one of those aspects, right? But a good one would actually maybe bring that out for people. I know that's been my personal experience where I mean, a lot of things can do that. I'm sure you've all walked through a museum or something or seen someone's work, and then you hear a story about it, or there's some other insight that's brought to you, and then all of a sudden it lights up, and I think artists can help that happen. But it goes back to the idea of the isolated artist. I'm like, okay, now I'm leaving my studio and I'm going to put this painting out here, and then I'm going to go hide back away, and that they have no actual humanity. They just make these works, and when that can become part of who that person is, and their motivations and stuff, then you can actually sometimes see more.
I want to take that in a slightly different direction, because it got me thinking about the different types of critics that this type of work might demand. In other words, maybe one critic you have is your standard art critic, but also you might have an organizer there, or a community member, or what have you, and having an artist have sort of a crit in a lot of ways from this, a diverse range of people, which essentially, as a political or social engaged artist you're trying to reach, is a really interesting process. Many artists do that. I mean, one of the things they do is when they work in a community, one of the first things to do is unveil it to the community, ask people what they think and what their questions are, and so on and so forth. We normally don't bestow those people with the role of critic, but if you're going to do political art and take it seriously, maybe that's exactly what should be happening.
Let's go with the plaid shirt guy, and yeah.
Yeah, I want to begin by saying that I really do agree with you on a lot, and more importantly,
I'm going to disagree.
that I really appreciate the topics that you're bringing up, some of which I haven't even thought of. But I am concerned that you might be applying different frameworks to your proposal for political art and to your critiques, and specifically that it seemed to me that when you offered your proposals for public art or for political art, that you understood it as part of a broader context and as part of a larger process of change. Whereas I felt like in your critiques, you really only considered the efficacy of certain schools of art, satirist parents. And that concerns me for two reasons. The first is that I feel like that's how you dismiss what seem to me to be very important schools, such as informative and expressionistic schools of art. But also that I think your discussion is actually very important and riveting, and I'm worried that those different frameworks kind of muddy everything.
You do a little. I actually I got everything until, and I think you're right, I think we are using different frameworks. And one of the things we actually didn't do, because we just don't have time, is that we actually think there's very effective political artwork being done throughout history. We just don't talk about it. We just pick 4 examples and said, okay, these are things that people, think of when we think of political art. They think of Carnegie, okay? They think of Hans Hopkins, so on and so forth. And so let's actually do a critique of some of the assumptions under that. But you seem to suggest, but you said something about that there's something, how a critique, or rather, there's something that Expressionism could say back to this critique that we're missing. So, like, what would that be? Because I'm interested in that.
Well, I'm not sure entirely. Maybe we're just thinking of my own comment differently. What I mean to say is that I feel like your critique of, for instance, Expressionism, is that you look at a piece of art and say, what did it change? Right. And if it didn't completely change the system, then you're dismissing it.
Right, I got it.
And I think that actually you can look at them, if you apply that broader perspective, you could look at them and say, what did they change, at least as part of a hierarchy of needs change?
Sure. Yeah. Do you want to answer that? I mean,
Well, one way I'd answer that is kind of going back to what we were saying at the end, which is this isn't really prescriptive, right? So us applying, like, going to Jackson Pollock's Ghost and saying, like, you didn't stop, I don't know, the CIA from doing this stuff while you were alive or something, or like you didn't end hunger, like you're a failure as an artist, like that would be applying some other standard that he's not even really interested in. Really, it's about like whatever we want to help people do whatever they're doing better. Like if you want to affect change and you're an artist, then it's really helpful to know about this stuff, and it's probably not being taught to you in school.
And the other thing is to think about this as steps on a scale. I actually think, I love Guernica, okay? And I actually do think it actually made a difference, right? It made a difference because it said the Spanish Republic is still the legitimate, ruling force of Spain at that moment. It said a difference because it basically became a rallying cry for leftists who were heading into those wars of fascism. The mistake, however, is not Picasso's. The mistake is when we look at that piece of work and not insert it back into what was a larger campaign of anti-fascism, okay? Because when it gets pulled out of there and ends up on a museum wall, or pulled out of there and ends up on a wall in the UN that then get covered over periodically, then it becomes deeply problematic. So I guess I don't want us to look like, with the exception of Richard Serra's piece we really don't like, like I said, we love all that artwork. We think it's great, and I mean, Hans Hopkins actually brought ideas of gentrification and slum control to a public stage.
And was threatening.
And he was But then what? Do we rely upon Hans Hopkins to do anything more? Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe it's up to other people to approach artists and say, do that, and then we'll take it from there. Yeah, and I agree with that.
So,
yeah. Well, my question will come not so much from the standpoint of the arts, but maybe from the standpoint of the place of, or arts criticism per se, and that way, but relate to the place of critical thinking in this all, or the place of radical thinking and radical thought, or the history of radical thought. And I was thinking very much in your presentation as an argument in favor of kind of strategic utopianism in art making.
Ooh, write that down.
Okay, or,
we got 2 of them out here.
Maybe utopianism of means rather than ends.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. But at the same time, I was thinking about, you mentioned Benjamin, and I was thinking about his statement about even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins. And so, in your engagement with history, you're drawing examples to sort of make your argument. But I wonder if there's something more that could be gained from a sort of hybridization of some sort of, I don't know, breaking into the china shop of history and exploding, like bringing in a kind of a sort of conceptual mapping. So in other words, not thinking of I have this information, I'm going to transmit it to you, but rather I'm going to go back in time, like Benjamin's proposing, to open up and shatter some of the platitudes that restrict our own way of mapping in the present.
What would that look like? Well, I mean, I'm down for the project, but what would it look like?
Well, that's my question, because I guess what I'm reaching toward is a way in which we can, I mean, this is about art and art making, but even moving beyond that to sort of open up a space for how we can cross-fertilize better between this whole history of radical thinking, not just as a question of here's my information on this is the way the world is, I'm going to communicate it to you, but I'm going to try and make a map so we can use this map and move forward and transform the world.
Well, I think a place to start, and this is what I do a little bit in my last book, is sort of taking on sort of the Enlightenment fallacy head on and talking about sort of Enlightenment ideals and progressivism being intertwined. The primary Enlightenment ideal is that the truth shall set you free, and that the truth is self-evident, and the truth is something which is self-replicating. In other words, that the truth doesn't need help. Essentially. And with that, I think as a tool, one can go back in history and say, what moments was that assumption not being made, and at what moments was it being made, and see what actually happens in those places. So that could be an interesting project for you. We're busy. No, but I want to talk more to you about how we might integrate that into our project. Over here.
I think it's, I really like your talk as well, and that's not, it sounds like a preamble to something. And what I'd really like to do with what you've presented to us today is jam it up against feminism. Because I think it really depends on how you're defining politics. The change that you've been talking about has been hugely establishment oriented. And politics actually does start in the home, and it starts between people. And so how are you going to begin to shift relationships between people? And this isn't, of course, simply gender. It's race, it's age, it's class, it's all sorts of things. And I'm just trying to think of particular artworks that could jam up against some of
Judy
your
Chicago stuff would be great.
things. I mean, there's obviously things like the Woman House Project and stuff like that, which was all about consciousness raising. But then I'm thinking also of a piece like Tanya Ostyk's Looking for a Husband with an EU Passport. I think which I think is probably the most important feminist work from the last 10 years, which was a 5-year-long project. Really interesting, the politics of sexuality, but also of economic migration and so on. Is it effective? I don't know, but it was lived. It was actually lived through. I mean, through that process, she actually found a husband with an EU passport and was able to become, an economic migrant.
Well, it makes me think of two things. One is, I think that next time we do it, there will be actually something about the first most political, because in some ways it's that sort of micro-politics, which I would argue in some way demands us to rethink the metrics which you use to talk about efficacy. But it doesn't absolve us from thinking about those metrics. You know what I mean? And the question would be, what sort of metrics are useful when the goal is not to topple this government or change this law, but is actually to change one's relationships with the immediate others, or even the relationships with yourself. But I do think that the same principles apply about knowing your goals and knowing your direction and the clarity and so on and so forth. So I actually think that would be an interesting thing for us to talk about, because you're right, all of the examples, it's not just that they were all about men, but they were also about sort of a masculinist politics with a big P. And I think that would actually be interesting, because in some ways I think it's those moments which actually make us think about, well, how do we measure change? How do we visualize change and I think we can. I don't know how to do it, but I think an artist who wants to change those things is beholden upon her or him to say, yeah, this is how I'll know when I've actually won. And these are the steps towards that win.
What I want to add to that too, just the technical at the end, is I think what we're trying to do too is, at that point when I said, okay, now we're going to tell you how to do it, and actually we can't tell you, is to create a set of tools or ways of thinking about these things that are broad enough that they can apply to that and to, like something happening in the White House, or, like that thinking of kind of what you were saying, like thinking about goals or thinking about your message can fit, it's broad enough to fit in any of those contexts.
So we should, maybe one last question and then.
Well,
maybe
we keep using the word win, which I find problematic.
Yeah, we do.
I'm gonna blame him.
But you could say make progress, you know.
Yeah.
This is a joke. I've watched Steve on this for a year, and then
And then he gave in.
And then
We're writing a book called How to Win.
And it's like a
Because we love
self-help,
to
like
be
Dale Carnegie.
self-help.
And yeah, it's a joke. But it's not. Okay, but wait. It's not a joke because one of the things we do when we do this is we're very serious about, are we in this to actually change things? And do we really want to take it seriously? What would winning actually look like? My favorite poster from Occupy Wall Street is a simple one on a piece of paper that says, winning. And it was this beautiful, beautiful poster because it was conceptualizing the win as opposed to what we always conceptualize, which is loss. So this is why I gave in after a year of fighting that.